Once upon a time, I was a big baby. That's not a joke. I came out weighing 10 pounds, 9 ounces. My mother didn't really have to push so much as just have a couple of Black Russians and let gravity do the rest. But yeah. What's the deal with rhetorical questions? Don't need to answer that. Just think about it for a second. More importantly, since I've grown into the fully fledged child of the universe, I suppose, that you see before you, I've learned a thing or two about a thing or two. In particular, what is the hardest thing about being an adult? In my experience, everything is the hardest thing about being an adult. It's like everybody expects you to do the right thing all the time, and that's it. No congratulations, no thank you. Just do the right thing. Don't screw up. Remember how easy it was to get kudos when we were kids? It was like, oh, you put a turd in the toilet. Good job. Really? I don't remember the last time anybody patted me on the back for not crapping my pants. But whenever I do make doo-doo, it's always the same old, stay away from Shawn at work, he smells. Again. Walking around with their nose up in the air like their shit don't stink. Assholes. I kid. When I was a kid, though, I had a few fears. One fear in particular was that I was afraid of the dark. And this isn't necessarily an uncommon fear. I think maybe many of us would agree that at some point in our lives we were afraid of the dark. And I used to think that there was monsters under the bed until one day I realized that those monsters were all in my head. Ooh, that's a deep, deep thought. I should write that into a poem. Maybe I'll write a haiku! Gesundheit. Yes, she's my favorite right now. I've been working on that joke for weeks and she's the only one that's laughing. Thank you, ma'am. You're a superstar. But I do kid. When I was a kid, I was afraid of the dark because, I wasn't sure what was out there. And I heard a story recently about a little girl that she approached one of the smartest guys in the world, Elon Musk, with her fears of the dark and asked him for some advice on what to do about it. And she was told by the smartest guy in the world, or one of them, that there's no reason to be afraid of the dark because the dark is simply the absence of light. It's just less photons than usual. And I thought to myself, that's a pretty neat thought. And kind of philosophical. When you think that oftentimes what we're afraid of isn't necessarily what's there, but we're afraid of what isn't there. When I was a kid, I was also very much afraid of dogs. It was kind of an unexplained phobia. There wasn't really any particular reason. Like ever since I was an infant, it was just this terrible thing that I had going on where even the friendliest dog in the neighborhood, it was it was either a Shih Tzu or a shit poodle or a, there I go again with the toilet language. I beg your pardon. But basically this little dog, it was the friendliest dog in the neighborhood. My mom told me all the time, every time that I saw this dog, I would just melt down in terror and anxiety, despite the fact that it would only lick my face and, crap on the lawn. Nothing to be afraid of at all. So Fast forward a few years, a couple of decades, when I was in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to actually take on a job as a dog sled tour guide. And I was offered the job in the summer, and I thought about it for a second or two, or 5 minutes, or 20 minutes, but I eventually agreed to take the job because I had learned recently at the time of something called immersion therapy in the psychology world, which is essentially where people who have like tremendous phobias of either like snakes or spiders or dogs, for instance, will put themselves in that situation and immerse themselves with the animals or whatever it is that's bugging them until they are sort of acquainted with it and realize that it's not as big of a deal as they once thought it was. So when I was offered this job as a dog sled tour guide, I thought to myself, yeah, go for it. Like, why not? And I'm really glad that I did, because I ended up going and working in Lake Louise, Alberta. I was basically working in a postcard. It was phenomenal. And I got to know the dogs. They're wonderful creatures. They were hardworking. They're fun-loving. They each had their own kind of separate personality that was distinct from the other. I used to think that all dogs were the same. I was very bigoted that way. But yeah, they were all the same. And the best part was the day that I realized, when I was on the back of the dog sled, I was kind of scooting along with some guests, and the mountains were all around, and it was a beautiful day. And I kind of thought to myself, I was like, why was I ever afraid of an animal that eats its own excrement? Like, doesn't make any sense. Thank you again. So anyway, yeah, I got over my fear of dogs, and I'm glad that I did, because a few years later I ended up getting my own dog, and with that dog I ended up meeting the love of my life. She's in the house tonight. Chantel, what's up? And so now I've got my dog and two giant step dogs to take care of, which is fantastic. Chantel's got two cane corsos. They're Italian Mastiffs. Don't ever think about trying to break into our place when we're not around, because they will eat you alive. The third thing that I wanted to talk about tonight was regarding my childhood fears and how I went about changing them is one that's like even more personal than the first two. It's tremendously personal. It was my childhood fear of my dad. I had a major fear of him growing up when I was younger, in part because the man was a giant. He was 6'5", 300 pounds, but worse than that, he would regularly walk around the house naked, which was traumatizing to no end, as I'm sure you don't want to imagine. But worse than even that, he also had a little bit of an anger management issue, which at times got the better of him. And, sometimes around the house, things would get a little bit ugly when Dad would lose his temper. And as a young boy being disciplined by a giant man using a belt to get a point across, it kind of had some negative effects on me. That being said, my dad was also one of the kindest, most generous, loving individuals that I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. He taught me many, many things, common everyday skills like how to cook and how to take care of myself and how to have fun and tell a joke and go fishing and play pool and all these sorts of things. But one of the most important things that he told me every time we talked on the phone was that he would end our conversations with a rhetorical question. And I'll leave you with a rhetorical question that he asked me every time we spoke growing up. after I left the house. Basically, we would have our chat. He'd give me some wonderful fatherly advice. And at the end of the call, he would always ask me, "Who loves you?" Thank you very much.